Welcome everyone to this event with the Defense and Security Foresight Group and Women in International Security Canada. And I'm Aisha Ahmed. I am the chair of the board of Women in International Security Canada, a member of the Defense and Security Foresight Group, co-leading the Middle East and North Africa team with Thomas Junot. And I'm delighted to be here today with you to talk about GBA Plus in emerging threats facing Canadian security. And, before we just jump right into the core part of our session today, which is going to be featuring some of our emerging thought leaders, we have with us 5 of our brilliant emerging thought leaders from the Women in International Security Network who will be featuring. I would like to speak for a moment about what we're doing here. So when DSFG first approached us, they thought we would do this session on women, peace, and security, and we went back to them and told them that actually WIIS Canada is a network of women scholars who do all kinds of different security questions and topics, and so what we thought would be really critical is to feature women from different fields, our emerging thought leaders who are working on digital security, national security, law and security, and gender and security issues. And so all of us coming here together, having been to the session which was on Tuesday, in which we were sort of taught about how to use this GBA Plus tool, we're going to be sharing our insights on what this GBA Plus tool means for our own research. And before I introduce my colleague from WIIS Canada, Professor Maria Martin de Almagro Iniesta, I would like to just take a moment to say, I'm a security scholar and the chair of the board of WIIS Canada, but I don't study gender and security. And it's so revolutionary, actually, that we're having this conversation, because when I started out, I study civil wars and insurgent groups. I'd end up on a panel with, all men, obviously, because that's the way it was and continues to be. That's one of the things that WIIS Canada tries to challenge. And I'd be the only person who had been on the ground talking to insurgents, and I would get the question about gender. And my colleague, who had never, left Ottawa or Boston or whatever, would get the question about the hard security issues on the ground. And I was so incredibly frustrated by that I was always assumed to be doing gender analysis, and I was never actually given the credit for the kind of work that I was doing. So I fought back that. And I really tried to establish myself as a security scholar who talks to rebels and insurgents and who, does the sharp end of the stick. And at some level, I was even almost socialized to suppress some of the gender analysis that naturally came out of my work, because to be honest with you, when I was in the field, I didn't have access to 50% of the population like my male colleagues. I talked to both men and women. But the interest, during that sort of formative part of the type of security studies that I do, was always, it was gendered in that people were interested in the men with the guns. But half of what I know is because I was speaking to the women in societies. And the fact that GBA Plus now has become mainstreamed and in fact essential to your analysis that's already revolutionary. And so as someone who sort of comes to this from a different angle, as someone who was socialized to, the way it was is like, can you do this with the boys? And I was like, I can do this better than the boys, And now, frankly, this is a situation which we're all being told that if you're not doing gender analysis in your work, it's, you're behind the curve. And so this is an amazing event. We have the opportunity to have women from so many different disciplines look at how GBA Plus can enhance their research. And I'm also incredibly grateful that we have with us my colleague, my friend from the board of directors of Women in International Security, Maria Martin de Almagro Iniesta, who is a professor at the University of Montreal and is also a lead on the new Women, Peace and Security Network funded by Minds. She's going to step in and maybe say a few words about the WPS network and will also be with us throughout the session. And like, I'm not a GBA Plus expert, but hopefully she'll be able to give some important guidance to our emerging thought leaders who are planning their projects about how to incorporate GBA Plus better in that work. And so, Maria, would you like to say a few words as we start off the session?
Sure. Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. As Aisha was saying, well, first of all, it's a pleasure for me to be here today. I'm here with my colleague Jennifer Welch from the University of McGill, and together with Professor Erin Baines at UBC, who could not be here today, could not join us, we have founded the Canada Research Network on Women, Peace and Security, and it has been generously funded by MINDS, the MINDS Collaborative Network Initiative. Me and Jennifer decided to share the workload for this presentation, and it will be Jennifer who will be making a short presentation on what we're trying to achieve with this network, how this network can also help you in your daily work, how you could also join us. And then at the end of the session, I will be the one as well taking questions and working with you on how GBA Plus is also integrated in the work that we're doing and that we're trying to do in our network. So I will just
Yes, my apologies. I didn't see Jennifer Welch come in until right after I had introduced you, but we are also incredibly fortunate to have Jennifer Welch with us from McGill. And so with no further ado, please do come in with your teammate and make the presentation.
Hi, I hope you can hear me. Can everyone hear me okay?
We can hear and see you.
I'm new to WebEx, so excuse me for being a little bit clunky with it. It's wonderful to be able to come and speak with you about the new network, very, very new, recently announced that we're putting together on women, peace and security, funded through the MINDS program at DND. MINDS now has 9 networks that it's put together over the last 3 years, some of which, including ours, are working on issues of women, peace and security. So perhaps just flip to the next slide if you would. Great. So I just wanted to give you a sense of the approach and structure, and I'll in a moment talk about our themes. But we, some of you may have heard or been involved in a discussion we had right at the beginning of the pandemic last year on Zoom, where we reached out to a number of scholars working on issues of WPS to try to determine whether there would be interest in having a research network that is Canadian-based, recognizing that we all are part of global networks, but was there actual value in doing something within Canada that would bring researchers together? So we had that meeting, and as well, Erin Baines engaged in a research project over the summer where she and a colleague interviewed a number of scholars across Canada. And on the basis of that, we decided to put together an application for MINDS. And MINDS is very much wanting to support networks and the creation of networks that will, in decentralized ways, really encourage, amplify, and disseminate research. So our approach is really threefold. Unlike some of their other networks, which I think have sort of 6 to 9 kind of nodes, we already have put together or identified 40 members across Canada who will be part of the network. It's a multidisciplinary and bilingual network. So scholars working in a number of different areas related to WPS, not necessarily just within IR or political science, but also sociology, anthropology, law, criminology, a number of different disciplines. And we're also linking it to our network to some international centers of excellence. So we have, Maria will correct me if I'm wrong, around 10 to 12 external scholars who are also identified as part of the network. One of our main goals with this network that came out of the research that we conducted over last summer was really this desire to develop a new generation of researchers on WPS. So in addition to the work of the different nodes in the network, we will have early career scholars as part of our core team. We will have postdoctoral fellow, doctoral fellowships, and research assistant positions that we in some cases have advertised or will be advertising. And we're also creating a youth advisory board modeled on the board created for the Beijing platform that will be part of the network and that will also be interacting with D&D. And then thirdly, we want to have active engagement with the policy community and with civil society. So as part of the network, we'll have annual roundtables, actually 2 per year with D&D, and an annual civil society knowledge exchange workshop. We are also going to be developing policy briefs coming out of roundtables and our annual symposium. So we'll have 3 symposiums over the life of the network, and an active website and innovative dissemination strategy. And part of what we will also do is provide some funding for nodes in the network to come up with ideas about research dissemination that we will financially support. We are also going to, it's not mentioned here, but we would like to have a summer institute. And for the first year, we can provide some seed funding for that, but we want to assist different nodes in the network to actually apply for and host summer institutes that will really be dedicated to skill building and knowledge exchange. So just the next slide, please. That's great. So we have identified, as we needed to do for the application, 3 thematic areas that are linked to the Mines policy challenges. And I want to stress here that, you know, our goal is for this network to outlive the Mines grant. And so we fully expect and hope that the research conducted by the nodes in the network will extend beyond just these 3 themes. But these are the themes that we will try to consciously organize some events and knowledge exchange around. And we also would like to recruit 3 research leads for each of these areas. And we'll be doing that relatively soon. So the first is on climate change and building national resilience, and will involve analyzing the gendered impacts on women, peace, and security, both at home and abroad as a result of climate change, collecting and disseminating best practices in greening defense, but also in ensuring civil military cooperation in addressing climate change impacts, whether that's within Canada or globally. Secondly, and this is quite a big bucket, Canada's defense relations. And here we want the network to engage in analysis of the gender dynamics of conflict, but also how to integrate that knowledge and analysis into defense and security policy, both in national and international organizations. Also understanding in particular women's agency and local community strategies in conflict settings, and integrating that understanding into specifically into protection of civilians doctrine and practice. And then finally, trying to identify and counter some of the challenges and backlash we're seeing to the WPS agenda, whether that's geopolitically or through certain transnational networks, and try to address those challenges very specifically. And here we see a link as well to Canada's feminist foreign policy. So we hope and expect that beyond the engagement with D&D, we will have engagement with GAC and key interlocutors there. And then lastly, D&D, as you can imagine, is interested in anticipating future security challenges. And here we hope the network will help to prepare D&D and the Canadian Armed Forces for different kinds of shock events, such as pandemics and more non-traditional security threats. One of the things we also want to do as part of the network is analyze the impact of CAF deployment in pandemic response, particularly within Canada, and analyze the impact, both positive and problematic, that may have had on some communities in Canada in particular, and then forecast some of the capability needs of D&D and the Canadian Armed Forces in response to the gendered impacts of conflict. So that's the broad thematics that we've identified for the network. And just one last slide, please. Just in terms of the organization, so there's 3 co-directors, myself, Maria, and Aaron Baines at UBC will be supported by a full-time network manager based at McGill. We are currently recruiting for that manager. So any of you interested or knowing someone who might be interested in playing that role, please let us know. We can send you the job description and application. We've also just advertised for a postdoc researcher at UBC, and we will be also providing 2 doctoral scholarships to fund doctoral work under our supervision, and dedicated graduate student research assistants that will be funded to support the 3 thematic leads. We will also have visiting fellowships from the Global South as funded again as part of the network. And if there's interest from D&D and secondment and fellowships to McGill, we'll have a scientific board, and we have already secured a Gba Plus advisor for all of our work, and we'll be integrating Gba Plus analysis into all of our work. And then we will have regular interaction with D&D throughout the life of the grant through a dedicated liaison we have, but also through the MINDS organization itself. They organize regular meetings among all the different networks, including one of the networks that's involved today. So that is it for the very brief Cook's tour of our new network. It's new. It requires your active engagement and input to help shape it. We do not want this to be a top-down network. This is a network we very much hope will grow with the involvement of researchers at every stage of their career.
Thank you so much, Jennifer and Maria, for introducing us to the network, and for, you know, all of these opportunities that you're presenting, not only for our WIIS Canada and DSFG members, everybody who's in the room. So this is a really great development, and I would encourage our members at WIIS Canada to engage. It's really quite extraordinary. Now, I would love for us, I know we don't have a ton of time, so I would love for us to jump into our engagement with our emerging thought leaders. And for those of you in the DSFG network who don't know who these incredible women are, who I'm about to introduce you to, what we have at WIIS Canada is a network of extraordinary scholars, and among them we've selected some of the best who we featured throughout the year in our Emerging Thought Leaders program. And they were women who were going to be presenting their research at our 2020 conference, which then got canceled like every other conference in the pandemic. And instead we thought, well, this is research that we really need to continue to showcase to the world. And so we developed the Emerging Thought Leaders program to take some of the brightest and most brilliant new women researchers from the WIIS Canada Network from a variety of different fields and showcase their work. And, you know, women in international security is not just women who are working on women and security or on gender and security. Our conference theme was future security challenges facing Canada, and we had women who were working on climate change, on cybersecurity, on national security threats, on civil wars. And so you're going to hear from women from a variety of research fields who will then tell you about how they have learned about this GBA Plus tool and how they have applied or might be able to apply that tool in their own work. So that's just a little snapshot of who's who in the room. And we're going to hear from Kristen Senke, who works on digital security, Priscilla Engtel, who works on gender and security, Sirisha Valupadas, who works on law and security, Shannon Hope Nash, who I believe you heard from yesterday, those who showed up on Arctic security, and Amy Barlow, who works on national security. And so I'm going to ask each of them to tell the room a little bit about what they do, and then how that GBA Plus tool applies to their work, what it's revealed, and also because we're fortunate to have, I believe Maria is going to be with us for the rest of the session. Jennifer, you're also welcome, but I heard you may have to log off. But if you have any questions about, or you know, how you could apply GBA Plus or some of the challenges you've faced, feel free to pose those questions to the room, to Maria, and then we'll probably be able to shake them out during the Q&A. So to get us started off, Kristen, would you like to share some of your research on digital security? I'm sorry, did we have trouble letting Kristen in? Oh, shucks. Okay, let's move forward then. If technology, it's it'd be a little bit of a problem. Priscilla, would you like to jump in? You seem to be like a great segue for us, given that you already work on gender and security.
Thank you, Aisha. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the presentation of the Minds Research Network on BPS agenda. And this is very exciting, I must say. Thank you also to Women in International Security for inviting me to this panel, and thank you for all of you being here. So yeah, I'm Priscilla Antil, PhD candidate at UQAM, and also a founding member of Fondation Louveau, which is a feminist and anti-racist collective. I research on feminist security studies, and my current research focuses on embodied and emotional processes of female ex-combatants in their reintegration to civilian society, and also on feminist militancy in post-peace settings, especially working on Colombia and Nepal. I'd like to start my talk by reviewing one of the questions we received for this webinar. Rather than thinking about how I decided to use GBA Plus, I would like to think about how GBA Plus came to my work, came to my research, but especially how intersectionality came to my work. In my view, GBA Plus is not a framework to apply. In fact, it emerges from my research, from my work as a feminist activist, and it kind of like being imposed from my field work. Aisha was talking about like the questions she received. I also work with insurgent female combatants. So this has been in so many ways something that I already had to live with in panel or conferences. So the intersectionality came as something that emerged from my field work, and I would say from an embodied praxis. So I would like to talk about two research processes one explicitly on Gba Plus and the other one on my PhD research. So between 2017 and 2019, with our feminist collective, we conducted a fieldwork researching on mainstream intersectional analysis and praxis in public policies in Colombia. And I particularly remember one activist, she told me, she participated in our research, and she told me, thanks to war, I discovered that I had rights. So, and you know, you can't really contradict her, even though this affirmation is kind of troubling. This particularly struck me because the frame for the production of Gba Plus, which also produces subjectivities and policies, is normally taught where war did not take place, or where there were not like conflict going on. And some of the frameworks are imposed from in a top-down approach also. So this research showed us that we were not really understanding where Gba Plus was coming from. And I remember especially this other woman activist from Buenaventura, which is a place that is particularly marked by the armed conflict. In her interview, she emphasized that on the one hand, it was women's struggles that created intersectional analysis and not the other way around. And on the other hand, that, and I'm retaking her words here, the concepts for liberation end up in terms of public officials. We have to reinvent other concepts because we have already lost them. And she was specifically talking about intersectionality and Gba Plus because she was thinking about all the work women's organization were doing in Colombia against political violence. So from this research, 5 elements emerged to rethink about Gba Plus regarding security and regarding human rights in Colombia. In Colombia, Gba Plus is called differential and intersectional approach, but it's kind of the similar postulates. So it's a particular context because it's really framed within an armed conflict, and it has been taught within the armed conflict. And this is why the woman was saying, because of the war, I know my rights now, you know. So 5 elements came out of the discussion. The first one was using an upstream intersectional pedagogy for public policymakers. So before applying Gba Plus, starting with intersectional pedagogy. I think cultural transformation against this machismo culture and racism that have been naturalized and institutionalized in laws and policy in Colombia. They were also saying that we need to internalize and translate international frameworks that have too little resonance into the Colombian context. Was linking intersectional public policy to social movement and inclusive citizenship, because they were saying there was this kind of division in between public policy and social movements. And finally, promoting an intersectionality from the margins. That was how they will frame it. That would put into question how and who is talking about Gba Plus or intersectionality. And they were questioning also including the circles of people who claim to be promoting Gba Plus. And at some point, this came at the end of the research to decolonization of this Gba Plus approach. On the other hand, and now reflecting a little bit on the title of this webinar, my doctoral thesis is about the reintegration of female ex-combatant. And through this research, I learned that Gba Plus can also be a threat in itself, in the sense that during my research, I felt the impact of adopting gender mainstreaming or feminist approaches, both for women participating in my research in their daily lives and activism, and for me in the research while I was conducting the research. When working with women insurgent activists, it necessarily involved kind of taking into account the intersection of experience in between being a victim and being a perpetrator of violence. But also in the case of the Fariana, the woman from the FARC, it implies thinking about the intersection of gender and class. And more than that, it means rethinking our relationship of feminist and gender approach to violence. So what does feminist has to say on violence? And it also means engaging the meaning of defense as a concept that has been almost unilaterally understood as a defense of a nation. Notably, some of the women that I interviewed and I was in dialogue with during my research were threatened precisely because they were implementing gender approach included in the peace agreement of the FARC. So their double subaltern position as a woman for the working class in Colombia and as a woman coming from an now unarmed Marxist-Leninist group imposed on them an increasing insecurity in the post-peace agreement. Their life were threatened, especially in particularly because they used Gba Plus to challenge the status quo and the structural violence that was perpetrated by state. And this brings me to the question of what we mean by security threat, and more importantly, how we frame that security for Canada. And that in itself will be a question I would like to bring up for discussion. What falls outside of our interpretative frames of analysis about security and about defense? Despite all, I've now been adopting openly feminist posture in my research for several years. I understand that this posture also will have to be justified before even starting to speak, especially in a field that is based on masculinist and colonial premises. And above all, a field that is rarely interested in listening to feminist research, as I remember, I think Andrea Lane pointed out on Tuesday. So what has Gba Plus has brought to my work? Much more rigor, in my opinion. It has indeed led me to ask very different questions and links between researchers and activists. And this in turn has fostered also translocal solidarities. So what are the challenges ahead? At least with regard to my research, the challenges have been increasing in the last year. I consider that we're now both facing strong social demands for racial and gender justice, but at the same time, we're facing an alarming anti-feminist backlash. And for example, I think that case of Colombia, which is currently facing a strong wave of state repression against bodies in struggle, we really need to think about this intersectionality of struggles. And in that case, precisely right now, intersectionality itself becomes more than a framework for politics. It's not just meant to be included in a politics of defense. It becomes in itself the embodied politics of defense. Bodies in struggle for survival, where the intersection of oppressions and embodied precariousness become the very conditions of possibility for that struggle. I think I'm gonna let it there.
No, that was brilliant, Priscilla, and thank you so much for such a strong start to the conversation. Forgive me, I neglected to mention we have another brilliant scholar from our emerging thought leaders community who works on gender and security here, who is Mariam Bouchard from the Royal Military College of Canada. And I was thinking this would be a perfect segue for you to jump in and give your insights onto. Tell us a bit about your research and then how you're able to use Gba Plus in your analysis and some of the challenges you're facing.
Thank you very much for this introduction. And I'd like to start by thanking WIIS Canada as a whole for the opportunity to be here today, as well as the DSF group for organizing the event. I think Gba Plus needs more attention and more critical discussion. So events like today are great for this. I'm Mariam Bouchard. I completed my bachelor's degree at the Royal Military College of Canada and my master's degree at Queen's University in political studies. I'm currently affiliated with the Network for Strategic Analysis, and I'm also a junior officer in the Canadian Armed Forces. So before I go any further, I'd just like to mention that the views that I'm going to express are only my own and do not represent the official position of the CAF or GND for that matter. I will start by describing my research as well as how GBA Plus was linked to it and what challenges I encountered with the framework GBA Plus. So my research was related to gender and peacekeeping. So like Priscilla, I was really into the gender and security aspect of the field. So I was looking at gender and peacekeeping through the lens of the LC initiative, which is a policy developed by the Government of Canada to increase the number and representation of women in peacekeeping operations, with the goal of having 15% of women deployed into peacekeeping contingents. One common claim and argument that I encountered during my research that really intrigued me was that more women would positively influence emissions effectiveness. So in addition to being to doing what's right, and then for equal opportunities of women who should be included in these deployments, there were also these widespread arguments that women peacekeepers would add something different to peacekeeping operations and would be able to make those missions more effective, enhance the mission's operational effectiveness. However, I found that there was too little or very little empirical analysis and background to substantiate this idea, and I was really interested to know more about it. So to explore this relation between gender and operational effectiveness, I conducted interviews with former peacekeepers, men and women, who were deployed in Canadian peacekeeping operations in the 1990s, and then analyzed after that the roles that women were playing in these different operations to try to develop an understanding of in what roles women would be able to influence operational effectiveness and in what conditions, and really know more about what the context was to this broader claim about women enhancing operational effectiveness. Throughout all of this, GBA Plus was central to the research, not formally at first, because I was not yet aware of the tool that was GBA Plus when I started this research in 2019. However, especially gender naturally became a central concept. One objective of the research was to critically examine the policy, so the LC initiative, to try to make it, to develop recommendations to make it both more effective and more fair to women and men. So more effective because if we know in what roles, in what type of deployments women, because of their sex and gender, can make a difference and have a bigger impact, the policy will be more effective, also more fair, in the sense that if we want to have 15% of women in any peacekeeping contingent that's deployed for UN operations, it's a lot to ask when we have below 20% of women in the Canadian Forces as a whole. So that places a toll and high expectations on women. It's also a bit unrealistic and perhaps unfair to ask them to change the dynamic of entire missions just based on their mere presence. So I was interested in these aspects. So gender and the whole analysis of the repercussions was central to the research proposal and framework, guiding framework. Conceptualizing gender was the second step that I took, and using this distinction that is probably second nature to most of us here today, but it is not always properly made, this distinction between sex and gender that's central to GBA Plus, allowed me to structure my analysis. So in order to having limited empirical backing to substantiate them, the claim that I made, that I expressed at the beginning of this presentation, so that having more women would influence positively operational effectiveness. This proposition did not clearly, in my view, express how gender and not simply sex or the fact of being a woman would have an impact on operational effectiveness. So I thought it was something very simple, but still something that had to be done to properly understand how women, and not simply an increased presence of women, would affect operational effectiveness. So this allowed me to distinguish very clearly between situations where physical appearance and sex were having an impact in some situations, although there was an element of complexity added, as you can imagine, if a woman is wearing a uniform, wearing a weapon, and then having a helmet on, and then all sorts of protections, even with the mask more recently. So attire that is mostly in the minds of many still attributed to the masculine sex. So that added a layer of complexity there, but differentiating between when was a feminine presence a factor and when was gender in a more performative way. So as a behavior or as an expression, when was gender actually having an impact on a more feminine to masculine spectrum. So I found that there were some situations in which being a woman, simply being a woman, was either helpful or neutral. In some situations, gender didn't or sex didn't have any impact on someone's capacity to perform a task and then contribute to the overall operational effectiveness of a mission. When in other contexts, behavior was highly influential. For example, in diffusing tense situations or conducting negotiations at a border crossing point, for example. So these are some roles with significant human interactions in which gender could have a positive influence. So it's, of course, a more nuanced understanding, and then it's highly dependent on context. So this distinction between gender and sex, although very simple, allowed me to really conceptualize the analysis that I conducted for this research. However, I encountered some challenges, and I imagine some of you may have faced them as well. Perhaps Priscilla, you mentioned you work with former FARC members and women, and perhaps several other people here today. So one of the challenges I encountered by looking at women and how their behavior could influence a mission's effectiveness, I was careful not to fall into the trap of essentializing them and providing a kind of an essentialist representation of women and their roles, and not to reinforce preconceived ideas of gender or gender roles. So if I found, for example, that women were oftentimes more effective at some types of communication in tense situations, they were often able to diffuse a situation or help. However, that is it's very difficult, or it's very easy to say that and then fall into the trap of saying women are just more patient or nurturing, or they have more they are more motherly, so people will trust them more. So I found it very difficult not to fall into those stereotypes. So I wonder if we'll be able to address this idea of how to study gender specifically and women, but not to reinforce existing ideas and stereotypes of gender roles. So this concludes the presentation. I had a few thoughts I had to share today, but I'll be happy to discuss further with all of you and then engage in a question period perhaps. So thank you for the opportunity today.
Thank you so much, Marianne. And I think this is a great segue. We've had two of our emerging thought leaders who specialize in security issues that are already related to gender. But now I'd like to introduce some of our ETLs who have different fields of study. And Sirisha Valupadas, I'm wondering if I could call on you. You are a Juris Doctor at the University of Calgary, working in law and security, particularly on terrorism law. And so I would love to hear a bit more about your work, and then also where it may intersect already with gender, if it does, and then how a GBA Plus analysis may enhance that work. So Sirisha, why don't you jump in?
For sure. Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to meet everybody. This is my first WIIS event, so I'm really excited to be here. My name is Sirisha Valupadas, and I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Alberta, and I did my Juris Doctor or law degree with the University of Calgary. So I'm a fresh graduate. I just graduated last year, and right now I'm articling at a full-service firm located in Calgary, Alberta. National security has always been a close interest to me. I did a lot of classes in my undergrad degree. actually hadn't been familiar with feminist approaches to politics. I had a really hard time figuring out how to reconcile the two because I just had no background. But I took a class about women and political science, and particularly international relations in my undergrad. And this was 2015 with the rise of ISIS, as you could say. It was all over the headlines. It was the discussion of every class we were in. And the most fascinating part, I think, about the whole situation is hearing about women my age and younger who were giving up this, cushy life in North America where they had all the freedoms in the world to go to Syria and actually be part of state building and ISIS state building. And it was just so fascinating to me because, as a young girl myself, I'm wondering, what is the lure here? Like, why are these women going? And in the media, they had a lot of talk about jihadi brides and the wives of ISIS and the widows of ISIS and all these sensationalized terms for women who were going over to Syria. And I started to think, just as a young woman myself, there's clearly a dichotomy here, as much as a guy is really good looking and, you have a great conversation with him online and he says, come and join me in Syria. As a woman myself, I'm like, you know what? I would need more than that to actually get on a plane and go to a war zone, right? So I knew there was more behind that. And there didn't seem to be good explanations for why women were choosing to go. So in undergrad, I specifically focused on those reasons, why women's agency is denied in situations like this, where women are taking off, going to war zones and contributing. Why does it seem like they've been hoodwinked? Why does it seem like that decision was influenced by somebody else? Now, when I went to law school, the situation in Syria started changing. The ISIS territory had diminished a lot, and it was more talk about what are we going to do with these people who came over from Western countries are now stuck in these refugee camps. And Canada has been pretty vocal on the fact, that they know there are citizens that are detained in Syria, and they don't really have a legal obligation to facilitate their return. Now, we've seen terrorism prosecutions in Canada, but the majority of defendants have been male. And it's not that there are no female terrorists. We know there are because we know how many women are present in these camps right now that are Canadian origin. But why aren't their prosecutions being focused on? And are there any legal blocks that prevent them from being prosecuted the same way Canada prosecutes men? So this was kind of an extension of my initial interest in undergrad. This is what I really wanted to look into, and I decided to do a directed research project with Dr. Michael Nesbitt of the University of Calgary, who's an expert on terrorism and Canadian terrorism prosecutions. So the majority of my research focuses more on what legal tools we have in Canada to prosecute women that have been suspected of terrorist activity, particularly with ISIS and the situation in Syria. What are the tools we have now? How are they being applied? And why won't they necessarily work the way we want them to work? So at the beginning of my research, I thought I would give some context about the I always have trouble with this word, infantilization of female militancy. It's not a new phenomenon where we don't believe women are capable of violence. It's been happening for hundreds of years in various war scenarios. And by characterizing women as, brides or coupling the term women with women and children when describing war zones, we are downplaying their own agency and making their own decisions, and we undermine them as a threat. And as much as we think this doesn't matter, it really, really does, because the other side often knows that in the West, we have a tendency to do this. For example, ISIS has actually realized that it's really helpful to have female suicide bombers. Why? Because they can get into checkpoints, right, without being searched. They're not assumed to be as dangerous as men, they can use their gender as actually a tool to aid in terrorist efforts. And they recognize this as a really good thing, and they recognize that we don't recognize this as a really bad thing, and they're able to take advantage of this type of perception that we have in the West about female militancy and not holding women responsible. So this has existed for a really long time, and it's not a new phenomenon, and it's exactly what seems to be happening with Canadian terrorism prosecutions. When examining Canadian terrorism prosecutions since the start of 9/11, the majority of terrorism defendants have been male. In fact, since then, Canada has only charged 3 women with terrorism offenses, and only one of them has actually been convicted. And this is a disparity because around 20 to 30% of all terrorism, I guess, accused are women who have been in Syria. So I had a look at what tools we have in Canada. So we have the Canadian Criminal Code, which basically standardizes the assessment of criminal accountability and articulates the requirements that are required to have a successful prosecution of someone. Now, coming up with something like the code is to create a forensic standardized way in which we are to characterize female militancy, but it's not working because we're not catching people that we seek to prosecute. If we look at the Canadian terrorism provisions, they're actually very broad, the way they're worded. So when you're prosecuting someone, there's 2 legal concepts. A lot of you probably know this from Legally Blonde or your own studies in terms of legal culpability. So there's actus reus and mens rea. The actus reus is actually the act of the terrorist activity you do. So it's the act of detonating a suicide bomb or the act of engaging in any types of violence. And then mens rea is the mental intent meant to do this. Now, the mens rea for terrorism activity is really broad. It's meant to be a tool for prosecutors to capture all this vague activity that might not count as terrorism, but we need it to count as terrorism to protect the safety of our public. So you would think that the broad characterization of the terrorism provisions would help prosecutors, but it's not helping prosecutors, and we need to look at why. Why isn't it helping prosecutors, and what kinds of things do we have to analyze about female terrorism activity, particularly in my case, the case of Syria? So let's take an example, and we can look at the nuances that are really difficult to tease and where a GBA perspective would be particularly helpful. Now, we have obvious examples of female terrorism activity. For example, females that are, pursuing violent activities like suicide bombing, females that are participating in all-female police forces to oppress civilian populations. But there are some gray areas in terms of determining that mens rea aspect, that intentional aspect of female culpability. Now, one that's particularly controversial is a woman going to Syria for the purpose of marrying a fighter, right? So how do you criminalize that? What types of questions do we ask ourselves? Now, the first question is whether the accused participated or contributed in the activity of a terrorist group. Now, a group like ISIS needs women. They need women for state building activity because you can't count as a political state if you don't have people that are rooted to that state. So women are actually they're used to root men to the state and ensure that type of loyalty and ensure the propagation of future male fighters. So they play a very key role in state building. So in terms of contributing to the activity of a terrorist group, that's pretty clear. Now, whether the accused was aware of the general nature of this activity, this is where lines get kind of gray, because you could have women who talk about, wanting to go and support someone, support their husband, but not necessarily wanting to support that terrorist activity. And are we going to police women and hold them criminally responsible for doing that, for their own agency as women, as wanting to support their husband and wanting to have children? Like, the right to have children is actually a human rights aspect, right? Like you can't criminalize for someone having children, even if it is for the purpose of state building. So you can kind of see the nuances and why it's difficult for Canada to prosecute women according to the Canadian Code, because it's our perception of what we hold as intention. Intention for us is barging into a war zone, right, and doing something blatantly obvious. But something that's not so obvious is, a woman following her husband to ISIS, having a child. Is the intention to have that child the intention any of us have, like in terms of having a child, or is it the intention to deliberately participate in state building? So this is why it's hard for prosecutors to kind of tease out the legal and policy intentions of why women go to Syria and why it's difficult to secure prosecutions. And a little bit more about the legal and policy implications. So even though we can prosecute women, should we? Are we opening a rabbit hole? Are we setting ourselves up for human rights violations in the pursuit of putting dangerous female offenders behind bars? And it's a problem that, you know, Canada's just started to poke at, but I don't think they've fully considered the implications of going through with prosecution strategies and what types of nuances are available. I think GBA perspectives are particularly helpful in teasing out those nuances and showing prosecutors where the difficulties lie and what types of evidentiary support they're going to need. This is a very new area of prosecutions. Again, we don't have the evidentiary evidence that are available with domestic prosecutions because you're trying to qualify evidence that's been collected abroad that hasn't been, say, handled properly, and non-traditional evidence, for example, social media accounts of female fighters, etc., that aren't exactly the smoking gun the way we tend to see evidence traditionally in the West. So this is kind of like a very brief overview of the type of research I've been pursuing. I think it's a fascinating area, and there are a lot of female scholars in the legal fields and defense fields that are doing really great work on this, and I'm hoping that, especially kind of growing up in like the same age range as a lot of the women who decided to go and are now sitting in camps, and you know, we underestimate their influence there because they are the ones raising children in camps that are still radicalized, if you think about it. I'm hoping to offer a little bit of a different perspective on the prosecution of female terrorist fighters in ISIS and Syria.
Thank you so much, Sarisha. I mean, that was so insightful, so interesting, and you know, a perfect segue into the next phase of our discussion. You know, you have been doing work on terrorism that has a pretty strong gender angle. I'd like to now talk to a couple of our scholars here from emerging thought leaders who are also working on terrorism, but from a different perspective. Amy, would you be willing to jump in and tell us a bit about your research?
Of course. Thank you so much for having me and providing me with the opportunity to share my doctoral research with you. I've actually opted to share this with you rather than the paper that my colleague Kirsten and I had written. She is the legal scholar. However, that paper that we wrote is actually derived from my dissertation. So this will make more sense if you've actually read the paper that we published. So my name is Amy Barlow. I'm an upper year PhD candidate in the Department of Politics at York University, and I specialize in international relations and comparative politics. My dissertation is titled Counterterrorism Discourses, Entrenched Islamophobia and the Rise of White Nationalist Terrorism in Canada and the United States. My research is a comparative case study that examines the threat perception of the so-called Islamic fundamentalist terrorist and how it has retained its durability in the national as a national security threat in both Canada and the United States since 9/11. This is contrasted with the threat perception posed by white nationalist terrorism, which receives considerably less attention, regardless of the fact that it was identified over 10 years ago by a variety of intelligence agencies as the most significant terrorist threat in North America. More specifically, I examine the intersectionality of race and masculinity and how they are socially constructed and linguistically represented by an idealized type of white maleness that actively fosters the production and reproduction of race-based discrimination of American and Canadian Muslim and Arab men. In an effort to fully flesh out the contours of my argument, I contrast three types of maleness: the so-called Islamic fundamentalist terrorist, the mythical, idealized white male, and the white nationalist terrorist through 6 cases that include the Iranian Revolution, 9/11, Omar Khadr, the Quebec mosque shooting, the El Paso, Texas shooting, and the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. Using most similar systems design, discourse analysis, and critical race theory through a Gba Plus lens, I examine how governmental rhetoric, mainstream media frames, and social media produce and reproduce a highly racialized narrative of the male Islamic fundamentalist terrorist. I argue that this is a result of widespread racial bias that informs a seemingly commonsensical understanding of who is considered to be a terrorist threat and who is not. I argue that this conceptualization produces a positive feedback loop, whereby the first factor, governmental rhetoric, increases the impact of the second factor, mainstream media frames, which increases the impact of the third factor, social media, which increases the intensity of the first factor by reaffirming its strength and position. In other words, when this commonsensical understanding of who is a terrorist threat and what he looks like reaches critical mass within the general population, people tend to vote for politicians who articulate their concerns. And this, of course, constitutes a positive feedback loop. How terrorist threats are understood and identified is actually of significant importance to national security, since these conceptualizations directly influence how, why, and what policies and laws are made and frame our understanding of who is a threat and who is not. The post-9/11 social construction of the male Islamic fundamentalist terrorist stems from the belief that terrorists are a clear and present danger, and by extension, all Muslim and Arab men are collectively thought to be vulnerable to radicalization. Conversely, white nationalist terrorist men are considered anomalous and deviant individuals whose violent actions are often viewed as a result of mental illness and/or social marginalization. The threat of the so-called Islamic fundamentalist terrorist is considered to be especially dangerous, as would-be terrorists can easily blend into society at large and attack at random. Due to the perceived imminence of this threat, it was defined by relying, and actually also continues to rely, on a very specific set of assumptions premised on a narrative that conflates terrorism with masculinity, race, and religion. Generalized assumptions of racial difference and masculinity are actually deeply ingrained in the fabric of the settler colonial countries of Canada and the United States. Both countries were founded on the belief of racial superiority that continues to exist in the structures and institutions. As Wolff points out, colonization was not an event, it's actually a structure. From the structure of an ideology, or from this structure, an ideology that I refer to as settler nationalism emerged. This comes from the myth that white settlers, namely men, created this country from nothing, and as such, they are the rightful heirs to the land. Simultaneously, this myth is furthered by an idealized type of male whiteness, who is successful, thrifty, moneyed, heteronormative, and Christian. In short, it is actually the Protestant ethic. National or settler nationalism entrenches white privilege and systems of white supremacy, which are deeply ingrained in the fabric of both countries. They are an invisible norm which measures all other races against it. It is from this perspective that the West imagined and continues to imagine itself as rational, just, non-violent, civilized, and Christian, in contrast to the East as being barbaric, backward, violent, uncivilized, and Muslim. Assumptions about race, religion, culture, and masculinity retain their analytical purchase and articulation in counterterrorism discourses and domestic counterterrorism policies. For example, the Arab or Muslim man is imagined to embody danger and violence in much the same way as the white Christian man is imagined to embody benevolence and nonviolence, and by virtue of this fact is simply incapable of committing acts of terrorism. As a result, the governmental myopic preoccupation with the male Islamic fundamentalist terrorist threat is actually, I argue, as a result of 2 decades worth of entrenched Islamophobia since 9/11, whereby the only terrorist who exists is the male Islamic fundamentalist terrorist. And what stems from this, or the reason that this really, is so significant, is it stems from racial bias. Consequently, political officials and the general public, particularly the white public, have difficulty envisioning and accepting that the white nationalist terrorism, not the Islamic fundamental terrorist, is actually the clear and present danger in Canada and the United States. Thank you very much. That's my dissertation in a nutshell.
Thank you so much, Amy, and hopefully we're going to get a chance to think a little bit about how a GBA plus analysis can help leverage your work even further in the policy world. So great insights there. And I would love to call on Shannon Nash, who, while I did mention she works on Arctic security, I think today she's going to present some of her incredible research on security and counterterrorism, because she actually has more than one specialization, which is very cool. And so Shannon Nash has a PhD in history from the University of Toronto, and is a postdoctoral fellow, I believe, with the North American and Arctic Defense and Security Network, and is a postdoc at Trent University. And so, using your national security lens right now, we'd love for you to chime in and build on this discussion, Shannon.
Great, thank you so much, and it's such a pleasure to be here today. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity to discuss my work, but also to learn from the fellow panelists. Going last, I got to listen and learn, and excited for the discussion that will follow. So my research is past and present terrorist threats and attacks, as well as Canadian, American, and international defense, security, and counterterrorism policies. So more specifically, my area of research is centered on the perception and reality of Al-Qaeda espionage methodology, and how the idea of a sleeper agent, so this neighbor next door, laying low, waiting to attack, how this idea was perceived and adapted to fit the terrorist threat posed by Al-Qaeda from the 1990s onwards. So I'm working on two projects right now that I thought I would share, just to give you a bit more familiarity with the background, and then I'll dive into some of the Gba Plus reflections. So the first project, it depicts a portrait of Al-Qaeda and its operational security in the 1990s up to and including 9/11. So these two projects divide my PhD dissertation at the inflection point of 9/11. So this first piece, it connects the dots of Al-Qaeda operational methodology and how the fluid idea of a sleeper was perceived and adapted in this lead up time to 9/11. So it's through case studies and involvement in past attacks, depiction of Al-Qaeda's strategy and operational tactics, insights into the scale of the threat. This monograph will discuss how Al-Qaeda used sleepers, or how they didn't use sleepers, rather, in the classic Russian espionage sense of long-term cover and creation and dormancy, but rather they use them as agents in place, or they use them as something more akin to what I've called nappers. And I clarify distorted views of the threat and link this to a need for preventative action, as well as a much needed context to the threat that gave root to fears of the terrorists next door waiting to strike. And so the second project connects this fear of an enemy within to the broader security, defense, social, and political implications after 9/11. So in an attempt to solve one problem, which in the first part I argue of the underappreciation of the threat posed by Al-Qaeda before 9/11 and a failure of imagination that's outlined in the 9/11 Commission report, North American officials in the media suffered from an excess of imagination after 9/11 and an overappreciation of Al-Qaeda sleepers. So exaggerated fears and perceptions, divorced from the reality of the threat, had the powerful and counterproductive effect of targeting Muslims and infringing on civil liberties, increasing defense spending and commitments overseas, as well as politicizing fear, affecting threat perceptions and therefore counterterror policies, and sustaining the idea that terror sleepers were waiting within. So this has profound connections to systemic racism and white supremacist domestic terrorist threat, misinformation, as well as evolving security threats. So I'd like to offer just some observations about how GBA Plus intersects with my work, and as well as some reflections. First, as a woman in the field of terrorism and security, as Dr. Catherine Brown, I recently read a couple pieces from her, which I found very interesting. She describes that herself as well as, I'm in a marginal position in an overwhelmingly male field in the discipline, but also in practice. And in addition, I'm writing about men. That's my topic. That's how the work is. I'll get into a couple of examples. That's really the focus. So I'm also a white woman, a non-Muslim, writing about Muslim communities, and also, as far as that marginality, how can I even begin to understand what communities face as an outsider? And I think about this a lot. And Dr. Brown speaks about being on the outside, that you don't just remain on the outside, that you can travel, the outside being your research, that you can travel towards the center with the research. And she frames the concept of marginality as a journey towards the center of the research. And I've been thinking about how I can do that and how my own research is shaping this journey. For me, part of this includes intentionally seeking out sources and perspectives within the field and outside of my own discipline, and broadening my own understanding of how my own views and data points can fit with my lived experiences. and other experiences that are foreign to me. So this marginality that Dr. Brown speaks of can also be a conscious decision to stand on the margins in a powerful place and hold a mirror up to mainstream and offer challenges and critiques. And especially over the last year, I have been more introspective about my work, really, I think, than ever, and the lenses that I apply and how I've looked at my research and critiques it offers and where it and both I fit. And in my own research, I can reflect now on our conception of terrorists and the intersection of gender. And like I said before, the research largely focused on men. So as we heard from previous panelists talking about women's participation, it's often shaped through the violence of men, or women's roles as stereotyped as modifying and moderating, having that modifying and moderating influence to men. So women are framed as vulnerable, returnees are seen as examples of victims or redeemable, or they can be readjusted. And in contrast, there's much more skepticism around men. And Dr. Brown also talks about this, about their skepticism around their stories of trauma, their stories that they didn't participate in violence, that they are seen as a threat to national security. And it's presumed for men that once a terrorist, always a terrorist. And this has implications for male and young people returnees. So the narratives of Al-Qaeda operatives in my research are dominated almost entirely by men, with intersecting factors of including age, race, and religion. So as Al-Qaeda has evolved, fractions of the movement have especially and increasingly shifted their ideology towards the acceptance of women's participation in armed conflicts, whereas traditional jihadists limited women's participation to supporting militant men. And that's a lot of the era, I suppose, that I study in the first iteration of the work. So in the mindfulness of time, I wanted to look at one specific example, and that's terrorist training manuals used by Al-Qaeda in the 1990s. So one training manual entitled Military Studies in the Jihad or Holy War Against Tyrants, also known as the Manchester Manual, because it was discovered by British authorities in May 2000 at the Manchester home of Al-Qaeda operative Anas al-Libi. So this was a text used at Al-Qaeda training camps, and the document, it's written exclusively for men. The wives of the operatives are referenced in passing, explicitly explaining to them the importance of keeping work secrets and concealing information. Those studying the manual were cautioned not to talk to their wives about jihad work and not to travel with them if there's a security risk in order to stay above detection. This again highlights indirectly how women's involvement can be seen as shaped by a man's. And the language throughout the manual is gendered with exclusive references to he, him, his pronouns, and to brother in the examples. In addition to the Manchester Manual, I studied documents from the Al-Qaeda and Associated Movement collection at the Conflict Records Research Center in DC. And these were captured documents by US and allied troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. And these likewise were written by men, for men, and about men. And the documents depicted the threat and reinforced threat perceptions. And there's important context here that North American Muslims' widespread rejection of violent extremism after 9/11, and dating before then, but looking at this time period, played a large role in shifting the environment within which Al-Qaeda could operate after 9/11, shifting it for the positive as far as playing a role in that counterterrorism. And my work is critical of counterterrorism policies and practices that had the effect of disproportionately targeting Muslims, particularly younger Muslim men, in the wake of 9/11. And I'm critical of the way men are treated and framed as particular kinds of men, and assumptions about stereotypes of Muslim men and the fixed idea of Islam. And that this then results in certain communities cast as particularly deviant because Muslim men are seen as threatening to the state, as Brown had talked about. And their masculinity factors into how they are perceived as a threat. And this goes a great example into refugee policies. So they're often explicit examples of how the threat is framed. So for example, in Canada, with their Syrian refugee policy in 2015, it singled out the acceptance of women, children, and families, which I connect to my work with this prolonged fear of sleepers. And one source explained that to deal with some of the ongoing concerns about security, unaccompanied men seeking asylum would not be part of the program. And in the US, more than a few politicians have voiced concern that young Muslim men pose security risks. So the Al-Qaeda operative, the sleeper, is depicted in the sources as nearly exclusively young to middle-aged Muslim male, and the intense paranoia and fear that followed 9/11 framed this threat. North America has largely followed a jihadi-centric threat narrative, and perceptions of who is a terrorist shape how we understand and address the reality of the threat. So I'd be happy to chat more in the Q&A about how this intersects with ideologically motivated violent extremism and white supremacy terrorism as well. The idea of sleepers living among us with the narrow focus on Islamic, Arab, male terrorists, all in quotes, over the last 2 decades has shaped expectations of who should be suspect. I link the search for terrorist enemies as inextricable from systemic racism, and this has powerful implications for equality and national security. And I argue in my work that the Muslimization of terrorism was a consequence of the search for an enemy within, and that it's fostered and inflamed Islamophobia. So this lays bare the debate about who is vulnerable and who is radicalized, who is considered the victim, and how are communities from which terrorists hail from perceived and understood. And in conclusion, my work has grappled with how white supremacy and entrenched masculinity are also ingrained in our perceptions of who is a threat, both with contemporary threats and also historical threats. And when violence occurred, what metaphorical box are we putting perpetrators and supporters in? And what does it mean to be a terrorist if the label is not applied equally? And these are important questions as racially and ethnically motivated discrimination has become uncomfortably mainstream, and in its violent form, a top terrorist threat. So acknowledging who terrorists are and who they aren't in rhetoric and in practice will take sustained and intentional effort. So thank you very much to WIIS Canada and to the DSFG for this opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
What a wonderful presentation, Shannon. Thank you so much. And I actually know we did have a question in the Q&A from Colin McGee, and I feel like your presentation really addressed it, about GBA plus and what genders are included, about are we equating gender with women? And you just showed how a GBA plus analysis can focus on masculinities. And I just thought that was so incredibly insightful. If someone else has a question, feel free to drop it into the Q&A. We don't have a lot of time left. And so what I really think we could make the most of our last 15 minutes together is I'd love to call on Maria to step in and give some feedback and some comments to all of our ETLs on their presentations, their use of GBA plus, and how they may be able to think about their research in the future. And then we'll go around and have all of you do a final lap of comments for 2 minutes each. But first, I'm going to give the floor to Maria for about 5 minutes to chime in here.
Thank you very much, Aisha. I'm going to try to be as brief as possible so that everybody has a chance to give their comments again. So this was fantastic. I'm really happy to be here because I have been editing the working paper series, and all of the emerging thought leaders here are writing or have already published their papers here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give broader comments and questions, and be free to decide on which ones you would like to push back. So the first, my first comment or idea was about pushing you a little bit again on the application of GBA plus to your research, because of course GBA plus analysis was first used as a policy instrument and conceived as a policy instrument, and here we are trying to apply it as well to research, right? So I would like to have so that the audience as well have a clear idea of how we could use GBA plus as an instrument that would shape not only the research questions that we ask, but also the basically the results that we will get. So could you maybe give one very concrete and clear example of how applying or failing to apply a GBA plus lenses would have given you a different result of your research? So, for example, I really like Shannon's idea of a GBA plus reflexivity approach, right? Second, also something that I am having troubles trying to understand myself is the difference between a GBA plus analysis and an intersectional approach or an intersectional analysis. What is different? How? And I think Priscilla was playing a little bit with that idea, and this idea about how when a marginal concept becomes co-opted by power. So how intersectionality as a concept was brought by Black feminist ideas about how different types of social markers combined provoke marginalizations and provoke violence. So how you cannot basically distinguish between how a Black woman from the working class working in a factory is discriminated not because she's a woman, not because she's Black, not because she's poor, but because of all the three things together, and they cannot be analyzed in a separate way, right? And there we are. We have a GBA plus concept, which is telling you that basically everything is an addition. So that you are adding to gender. First of all, you have gender, and then you add layers to that, right? You add race, you add class, etc. And that's basically against what Black feminist ideas were telling us what intersectional analyses are. So do you see GBA plus as being different from intersectionality? How is power analyzed in GBA plus analysis? And here it takes me to the second question. You have all demonstrated how new young researchers are taking very seriously the fact not only that sex is different to gender, and that gender is about both femininities and masculinities, but and also how we should take into account race, class, ethnicity, etc. But also, and something that I haven't seen that clearly, and that I could maybe again push you further there, is that, and maybe it's the fault of the instrument that we have, maybe it's the fault of GBA plus as an instrument, is that, well, it's very good at understanding individual identities and the consequences of those identities. It's not that clear how a GBA plus analysis can be used to understand gender as a symbolic structure of power. And again, I'm going back here to Priscilla's idea about what falls outside our interpretive analysis of security and defense, what falls outside our analysis of gender and of intersectionality if we forget about the symbolic structures of power. I think I'm going to leave it there because it's already a lot from my thing.
No, thank you, because we now have everybody 1 to 2 minutes to have an opportunity to respond, which is so unfair. I know it's unfair, but Priscilla, would you be able to jump in and give your response and final thoughts?
Well, I'm going to try to do it in 2 minutes. First, for the question on the chat, I personally had within my research transgender insurgent militant that really shaped the idea of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. So I do think that the problem is, like, for example, the peace agreement of the FARC was victim of a backlash in LGBTQ rights when they try to make the peace agreement voted in the population. So they removed a lot of the LGBTQ approach that was in there, so it was really difficult for them to apply it then after. Regarding what Maria just asked, well, like very complex questions. I was fighting a lot between my framework of intersectionality and the GBA plus approach, because I also feel that the plus is not really representing what we want to say or we want to challenge, because it's a plus, it means addition. And so I was like trying to reflect and see how we can analyze power in there, and it's kind of difficult for me because it seems that we have a category that is kind of before, like we're taking a category before the other one and the other ones, and it's also, we need to reflect on that because it's really a Canadian approach also, and it's a Canadian approach that I've been taught as the third gender mainstreaming wave, we can say. So it has a very different way of being seen in many countries, and this is why I was trying to put the discussion on the fact that the women in Colombia were saying, well, it's imposed from above. We haven't talked about that this way, like, yeah. But yeah, we can do another webinar on that.
We totally could, and so I'm gonna thank you so much, Priscilla. But everybody, maybe 1 minute to just respond. I know we could stay for another hour, but we're up at 1:30. So, Marianne, why don't you give us your final thoughts?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Dr. De Almagro, for these questions. They are very stimulating. I don't have an answer at this point because I've also been struggling about the differentiation between GBA plus and intersectionality. I'm also thinking that the plus is kind of there as an afterthought to focus on gender first, which has implications that we should all be thinking about. It's also perhaps difficult to do it when, for example, my own research was focusing on gender and on women in particular. So it's important to keep it in mind, but I'm also reflecting on how it's possible to have this intersectional approach first, this lens first, and then going into perhaps gender implications. So these are some thoughts that I've been having recently, and I'm really thankful for having had the opportunity to exchange and hear other people in different disciplines as well reflect on these questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marianne. Sarisha, your final thoughts.
Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you so much for those follow-up questions. It's really made me think a lot about where to go in the future. I think there are so many places, especially in law, to incorporate GBA+. I think the problem with law is it thinks it's objective, but it's not. So I think as an institution, there's a lot of work to do in terms of recognizing, that objective always comes from somewhere. In the law, you're always talking about the standard of the reasonable person, but who is the reasonable person? Who is that reasonable person based on? So not just like in terms of my topic, like with like female terrorism, but in general, like with law as an institution, I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of figuring out ways to incorporate this perspective in a way that's not thought as uncomplimentary to what law is supposed to be, which is objective and standardized. So there's a lot of work to do, and I'm glad that the future is bright with all of my colleagues and all of my mentors. I think we have a lot of great potential to take our research and make these concepts propel forward.
Thanks so much, Sarisha. Amy, want to jump in?
Sure. Hi. Yes, thank you for those questions. I appreciate them, and hearing everybody's perspectives has been fascinating. I actually come from a poli-sci / gender background when I did my undergrad degree at U of T. So this has always been sort of a natural extension, and it always makes an appearance in my work, whether I actually notice it at the outset or not. One of the things that really, one of my central questions in my research is actually about power. Who has it? Who wields it? What is it? How is it obtained? And it took, through the analysis of language and its understanding, or how it provides us with an understanding of the world in which we live. Discourse can be created to say many different things. But when it becomes an overarching meta-narrative, it becomes something that the population understands as commonsensical. And the racial differences become hard certainly for white people to imagine. But they become very visible with the very public phenomena of the Karen and how whiteness operates in a gendered lens. And particularly, I'm sure you guys have all seen that tape of the woman in Central Park and the black men. This right here, that very example, demonstrates this disconnect and misunderstanding of racialized and gendered understandings of who is a threat and who is not. And while that's not an example within my work of terrorism, it seems to really provide strong elucidation on how people see and determine who's a threat and who isn't. So those are just my thoughts. I could probably go on forever, and I don't want to. I realize we have limited time, but thank you.
Super important insights, Amy. I really appreciate that you're highlighting this issue of race. I'm just going to ask Shannon, still with us? Yes, okay, sorry, it moved on my screen. Shannon, would you like to make your final thoughts? I know we only have a minute or so left, but go ahead.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the comments, Maria, and your edits on the working paper as well. As a student of history, as a historian, part of my work is looking at the sources available and finding the story. 15-second tidbit is when I started the PhD, I had a big map out on my table, almost like the FBI lines, trying to draw lines where the sleepers were, what did we call them, what did one person say. But the rhetoric, while the rhetoric mattered, I was following the wrong line of inquiry. And what the side of the effect was is that I needed to be looking at what the idea of someone within, what that meant. And that was also applying that GBA plus lens and those implications and effects and the intersections of the sleeper concept beyond civil liberties and infringements. And now I'm on my journey to continue to understand how that is folded in to systemic racism. And this ties into power. When further applying GBA plus, it brought forward critiques as well as how to understand the threat and risk assessments and where they are founded in reality. As well as quality source bases. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Shannon. And, I want to thank all of our emerging thought leaders for being here. Maria, for your exceptional comments. You really stimulated me today when you were talking about, well, what's the difference between GBA plus and intersectionality? And it struck me that, we've said gender-based analysis plus other stuff. But that speaks to how this discourse has evolved over time, but it's not race-based analysis plus other stuff. And you could think about, well, what are you privileging as the first thing that we think about, and intersectionality, it's not a question of, oh, well, we're all going to start with the assumption that gender is the primary variable, and then there's maybe some other stuff layered on top of it. So such a stimulating way for us to think about and critically analyze even this tool itself and how we're thinking about the utilization of this tool. And so love what you're doing, every single one of you. Just a brilliant set of presentations. Thank you also to Kirsty from the Defense and Security Foresight Group, to our partners in WIIS Canada at the Defense and Security Foresight Group for creating this webinar series on such an important topic, and to my two brilliant colleagues and research assistants, Sanjita Amin and Tanya Bandula-Irwin, for all of the work behind the scenes. Thank you everyone for such a fruitful afternoon, so much food for thought, and please stay in touch with us at WIIS Canada and the Defense and Security Foresight Group moving forward. And of course, the new Women, Peace and Security Network. We're really excited to continue to engage with you in these exciting webinar series and in other events.